Have you ever felt that moment when your blood turns to ice, when you recognize danger before your mind can even process it? That primal instinct that screams at you to run, even when your feet won't move. If you're watching this from somewhere that feels safe tonight, hold on to that feeling, because not everyone has that luxury. The dinner rush at Romano's was in full swing when Catalina Reyes felt her world tilt sideways. She'd been balancing 4 plates of osso buco on her left arm while refilling water glasses with her right, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd waited tables for 6 years. At 24, she had the kind of quiet competence that made customers feel cared for without being overwhelmed. Her dark hair always pulled back in a neat ponytail, her movements graceful even during the chaos of a busy Friday night in Chicago's Little Italy. The restaurant hummed with the comfortable sounds of clinking silverware and murmured conversations, the warm lighting casting everything in a golden glow that made the exposed brick walls feel welcoming rather than industrial. She'd been working at Romano's for 3 months now, ever since she'd finally found the courage to leave Derek and needed a job that paid well enough to cover her tiny studio apartment on the north side. The tips were good here, the other servers looked out for each other, and most importantly, Derek didn't know where she worked. Or at least, she'd thought he didn't. Catalina had been smiling at table 12, asking if they needed anything else with their tiramisu, when she felt it. That crawling sensation between her shoulder blades, the one that meant someone was watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She'd learned to trust that feeling during the 18 months she'd spent with Derek Mason, when his mood could shift from charming to controlling in the space of a heartbeat, when she'd had to read the smallest signs to know whether she was about to face his anger or his false sweetness. She turned slowly, hoping she was wrong, praying it was just her paranoia playing tricks on her again. But there he was, standing just inside the restaurant's entrance like he owned the place, his pale blue eyes scanning the dining room until they locked onto hers. Derek Mason, 28 years old and still devastatingly handsome in that clean-cut way that at first attracted her, still wearing the kind of expensive button-down shirt that made people assume he was successful and trustworthy. Still smiling that smile that had once made her feel special, but now made her feel hunted. The water pitcher slipped from her numb fingers, crashing to the hardwood floor in an explosion of glass and water that made half the dining room turn to look. Catalina barely heard the concerned voices around her, barely felt Maria, one of the other servers, grabbing her arm and asking if she was okay. All she could see was Derek, still standing there, still watching her with that possessive intensity that she remembered from their worst nights together. He looked exactly the same. Same perfectly styled brown hair, same strong jaw, same broad shoulders that had once made her feel protected but had become a reminder of how easily he could overpower her. Same way of dressing that announced his success as a financial advisor. Same confident posture that declared he had every right to be wherever he wanted to be. The only difference was in his eyes, where she could see a cold anger that made her stomach drop. 3 months. She'd had 3 months of peace. 3 months of sleeping through the night without jolting awake at every sound. 3 months of not checking over her shoulder every time she left her apartment. 3 months of slowly remembering who she'd been before Derek had systematically stripped away her confidence, her friends, her sense of self-worth. She'd been healing, finally, starting to believe that maybe she could build a life where she didn't have to be afraid. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The last night she'd spent in Derek's apartment, when she'd finally worked up the courage to tell him she was leaving. She could still feel the bruise his fingers had left on her wrist when he'd grabbed her, could still hear his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone he used when he was furious but trying to maintain control. You think you can just walk away from me, Catalina? You think anyone else is going to want damaged goods like you? I made you into something worth having, and I can unmake you just as easily. She'd run that night, literally run, grabbing only her purse and the clothes on her back. She'd spent the next week sleeping on her sister Sophia's couch until she could find her own place, jumping every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door. Derek had called and texted constantly for the first month, switching between apologies and threats, between promises to change and reminders of how helpless she was without him. When she'd blocked his number, he'd started showing up at places he thought she might be. Her old gym, the coffee shop where she used to study, even her mother's house in Pilsen. But then the calls had stopped. The surprise appearances had ended. For 3 months, she'd allowed herself to believe that maybe he'd finally moved on. Maybe he'd found someone else to control and manipulate. She should have known better. Derek Mason didn't let go of things he considered his property, and in his mind, that's all she'd ever been. Now he was walking toward her section, moving with that same easy confidence that had once charmed her, and Catalina felt every hard-won bit of progress slip away. Her hands were shaking so badly, she couldn't pick up the larger pieces of broken glass, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps that made her vision blur around the edges. She was dimly aware of Maria trying to clean up the mess, of other servers gathering around to help, but all she could focus on was Derek's approach. He was taking his time, she realized, drawing out the moment because he knew how much it was affecting her. This was part of his game, part of how he maintained control. He wanted her to see him coming, wanted her to have time to remember exactly how powerless he could make her feel. By the time he reached her, she was trembling so hard that Maria had taken the broken glass away from her, afraid she was going to cut herself. Derek stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent that used to comfort her, but now made her nauseous. His smile was warm and concerned, the kind of expression that would make any observer think he was a caring boyfriend worried about his clumsy girlfriend. But Catalina could see the calculation behind it, the way he was already assessing the situation, figuring out how to use her public breakdown to his advantage. "Catalina, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for nearby tables to hear, full of what sounded like genuine concern. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there and shake while her carefully rebuilt world crumbled around her. The other servers were watching now, confused by her reaction, not understanding why the arrival of what appeared to be a handsome, well-dressed man had reduced their competent colleague to a trembling mess. She wanted to explain, wanted to scream that this man had spent 18 months systematically destroying her self-worth, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just stood there in the middle of Romano's dining room, surrounded by concerned co-workers and curious customers, while the man who had once promised to love her forever smiled down at her with cold satisfaction and began to plan her destruction all over again. Dante Romano had been watching the scene unfold from his usual corner table, where he could observe the entire dining room while keeping his back to the wall. At 35, he'd learned to read people and situations with the kind of precision that kept him alive in his particular line of work, and right now every instinct was telling him that something was very wrong with the pretty waitress who had just shattered a water pitcher. He'd been coming to Romano's for dinner twice a week for the past 3 months, always requesting table 14, always arriving at exactly 8:30 when the dinner rush was winding down. The restaurant held special meaning for him beyond the excellent food. It had been his grandfather's favorite place, back when the old man was building the family's legitimate businesses in Little Italy. Dante kept the tradition alive, partly out of sentiment, and partly because it was good for business to be seen supporting local establishments. The waitress, Catalina, had been serving his section since she'd started working there, and he'd noticed her immediately. Not just because she was beautiful, though she certainly was, with those warm brown eyes and the kind of quiet grace that drew attention without demanding it. No, what had caught his interest was her hypervigilance, the way she constantly scanned her surroundings, the careful distance she maintained with male customers. He recognized the signs because he'd grown up watching his mother display the same behaviors, years after his father had finally eliminated the threat of her abusive first husband. Now, watching her stand frozen while a well-dressed man approached her with predatory confidence, Dante felt that familiar cold anger settle in his chest. He'd seen this exact scenario play out before, had learned to recognize the particular brand of fear that came from intimate violence. The way Catalina was trembling, the way she'd gone completely still except for the shaking, the way her eyes had gone wide and unfocused, it was textbook trauma response. The man reached her, stopping just close enough to invade her personal space without making it obvious to casual observers. Dante could see his mouth moving, could read the false concern in his body language, the way he was positioning himself to appear caring while actually trapping her between his body and the service station behind her. Classic predator behavior, disguised as worry for a distressed girlfriend. Dante set down his wine glass and stood slowly, his 6'3" frame unfolding with deliberate grace. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that cost more than most people made in a month, his dark hair styled with the kind of precision that suggested both wealth and attention to detail. At first glance, he might have looked like any other successful businessman enjoying dinner at an upscale restaurant. But there was something in his posture, in the way he moved with controlled power, that made smart people give him a wide berth. He reached Catalina's section just as the man was reaching for her wrist, his fingers closing around the delicate bones with enough force to make her wince. Derek, Dante had heard him call himself when he'd spoken to her earlier, was smiling that particular smile that bullies used when they wanted to appear reasonable while doing something cruel. "We're going home now," Derek was saying, his voice pitched low but not low enough to escape Dante's hearing. "You've had your little tantrum, sweetheart, but it's time to stop embarrassing yourself and come back where you belong." Catalina tried to pull her wrist free, but Derek's grip tightened, and Dante saw her face go even paler as the pressure increased. That was enough. He'd seen plenty of violence in his 35 years, had ordered his share, and committed more than he cared to remember. But there was something about watching a man terrorize a woman who couldn't fight back that ignited a rage in him that was both personal and professional. "Excuse me," Dante said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from years of having his words obeyed without question. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make any threatening gestures, but something in his tone made Derek's head snap up and several nearby diners glance over nervously. Derek looked him up and down, taking in the expensive suit and confident posture, clearly trying to assess whether this stranger represented a threat or just another wealthy customer who didn't want to get involved. Derek was probably used to intimidating people through physical presence. He was a big man, well-built, and clearly comfortable using his size to his advantage. But Dante had learned long ago that true power didn't come from muscles or loud voices. It came from the absolute certainty that you could and would follow through on any promise you made. "I think the lady would prefer if you waited outside," Dante continued, stepping closer with the same deliberate grace he'd used to approach. His hands remained at his sides, his expression pleasant, but there was something in his dark eyes that made Derek's confident smile falter slightly. "This is a private conversation," Derek replied, trying to reassert control of the situation. His grip on Catalina's wrist tightened further, and Dante saw her bite her lip to keep from crying out. "My girlfriend and I are just having a little misunderstanding. Nothing that concerns you." Dante let his gaze drop pointedly to where Derek's fingers were wrapped around Catalina's wrist, then back up to meet Derek's eyes. In his world, a look like that was usually enough to end most arguments. But Derek was either too stupid or too arrogant to recognize the warning. "She doesn't look like she wants to have this conversation," Dante observed, his voice remaining conversational despite the ice that was spreading through it. "In fact, she looks like she'd prefer if you left her alone entirely. I'm going to suggest again that you wait outside." This time, there was no mistaking the threat beneath the polite words. Derek must have heard it too, because his face flushed red and he finally released Catalina's wrist, though he didn't step back. Instead, he puffed up his chest and moved closer to Dante, apparently deciding that his pride was worth more than his safety. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Derek demanded, his voice rising enough to draw more attention from other diners. "You think because you've got an expensive suit you can just butt into other people's business? This is between me and my girl, so why don't you mind your own damn business before you get hurt?" Dante smiled then, the kind of smile that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. It was the expression of someone who had never made a threat he couldn't back up, someone who viewed violence not as a loss of control, but as a tool to be used precisely when necessary. "My name is Dante Romano," he said simply, and watched Derek's face go white as the implications sank in. "This is my neighborhood, this is my restaurant, and this young lady is clearly under distress. So I'm going to ask you one more time, very politely, to wait outside while we sort this out." The Romano name carried weight in Little Italy, had for 3 generations. Derek might not have known the specifics of the family business, but he was clearly smart enough to recognize that he was no longer dealing with just another customer who wanted to play hero. He looked around the restaurant. noting for the first time how other diners had gone quiet, how the servers had positioned themselves at a respectful distance, how even the kitchen staff had emerged to watch through the past window. "This isn't over," Derek said finally, his voice shaking with impotent rage. He pointed at Catalina, who was still standing frozen beside the service station. "You can hide behind your new boyfriend for now, but I know where you work, sweetheart. I know where your sister lives. This isn't over by a long shot." Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his shoulders rigid with fury and humiliation. Dante watched him go, noting the license plate of the dark sedan Derek climbed into, already making mental notes about the conversation he'd be having with his security team tomorrow. When Derek's car disappeared into Chicago traffic, Dante turned his attention back to Catalina, who was staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror that he found disturbingly familiar. She was still shaking, he realized, her dark eyes wide with the kind of shock that came from having your worst nightmare suddenly appear in what should have been a safe space. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice losing all traces of the cold authority he'd used with Derek. She nodded, but it was clearly automatic response rather than actual assessment. Her manager, a thin, nervous man named Giuseppe, had appeared at her elbow, wringing his hands and looking between Catalina and Dante like he wasn't sure which one represented more potential trouble. "Giuseppe," Dante said, recognizing the man from previous visits, "I think Miss Catalina should go home early tonight. This has been traumatic enough without having to finish her shift." "Of course, Mr. Romano," Giuseppe agreed quickly. "Catalina, honey, take the rest of the night off. Maria can cover your tables." Dante looked back at Catalina, who seemed to be slowly coming back to herself, the immediate shock fading enough for her to process what had just happened. Her hand moved unconsciously to her wrist, rubbing the place where Derek had grabbed her, and Dante felt that cold anger flare again. "May I drive you home?" he offered. "I don't think you should be alone tonight, not after what just happened." Catalina looked at him for a long moment, and he could practically see her trying to decide whether accepting help from a man she barely knew was better or worse than facing whatever Derek might have planned next. Finally, she nodded, a single jerky movement that suggested she was operating more on survival instinct than rational thought. As they left Romano's together, Dante made another mental note to have his people look into Derek Mason's background. Because one thing was absolutely certain: Derek had been wrong when he'd said this wasn't over. It was over, completely and permanently. Derek just didn't know it yet. Catalina woke up in a room she didn't recognize, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. For a moment, panic gripped her as she tried to remember where she was and how she'd gotten there. But then the events of the previous night came flooding back. Derek at the restaurant, the water pitcher shattering, Dante Romano stepping in with that quiet, terrifying authority that had sent Derek slinking away like the coward he really was. The guest bedroom in Dante's penthouse was larger than her entire studio apartment, decorated in warm neutrals that somehow managed to feel welcoming despite the obvious expense of everything from the Egyptian cotton sheets to the original artwork on the walls. She'd been too exhausted and emotionally drained the night before to really take in her surroundings, but now she could see that every detail spoke of wealth and refined taste. She found Dante in the kitchen, which was like something out of a magazine, with its professional-grade appliances and marble countertops that probably cost more than she made in a year. He was standing at the stove wearing dark jeans and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair still slightly damp from a shower. He looked different in casual clothes, less intimidating somehow, though there was still something about the way he carried himself that suggested he was never truly relaxed. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her hovering in the doorway. "I hope you slept well. I wasn't sure what you liked for breakfast, so I made coffee and was about to start some eggs." The smell of fresh coffee was already filling the air, rich and comforting in a way that made her realize she hadn't had a proper cup in months. The coffee at her apartment came from whatever was cheapest at the grocery store, nothing like the obviously expensive blend Dante was brewing. "Coffee sounds perfect," she said, accepting the mug he offered her. It was warm ceramic, substantial in her hands, and when she took a sip, she couldn't help but close her eyes at the taste. This was the kind of coffee she'd dreamed about during those long morning shifts at the diner where she'd worked before Romano's. back when every penny had to stretch to cover rent and groceries. He moved around the kitchen with surprising ease for someone who clearly employed people to handle domestic tasks, cracking eggs into a bowl and whisking them with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't just for show. There was something almost mesmerizing about watching his hands work, the way his fingers moved with the same controlled precision she'd witnessed when he'd dealt with Derek. "I should probably explain," Dante said as he heated butter in a pan. "About last night, about who I am. You deserve to know what you're getting involved in." Catalina set down her coffee mug, suddenly nervous. The Romano name had meant something to Derek, had been enough to send him running, but she hadn't wanted to think too hard about the implications. In her neighborhood, there were rumors about certain families, certain businesses that operated in the shadows between legitimate and not quite legal. She'd always try to stay away from that world, to keep her head down and focus on building a quiet, safe life. "My family has been in Chicago for 3 generations," Dante continued, pouring the eggs into the pan where they began to sizzle softly. "We own several legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction, import-export. But we also handle security and problem resolution for people who need services the police can't provide." He was giving her the sanitized version, she realized, the explanation he might give to someone who didn't need to know the full extent of what the Romano family did. But even the careful wording was enough to confirm what she'd suspected. This man who had saved her from Derek's threats was himself dangerous, connected to a world where problems were solved through violence and intimidation. "The restaurant where I work," she said slowly. "Romano's. That's yours?" "One of them, yes. My grandfather used to eat there when he was courting my grandmother. I've been keeping the tradition alive." He plated the eggs with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to everything, adding toast that had been perfectly golden and a small portion of fresh fruit that looked like it had come from some expensive market. When he set the plate in front of her, she realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for her, had taken care of her needs without expecting something in return. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question that had been nagging at her since the previous night. "You don't even know me." Dante sat across from her with his own plate, his dark eyes serious. "I know enough. I know that man was hurting you, and I know you're afraid of him. I also know what it looks like when someone is trapped in a situation they can't escape alone." There was something in his voice, a note of old pain that made her look at him more closely. For all his obvious power and confidence, she could see shadows in his expression that suggested he understood fear and helplessness from personal experience. "My mother was in an abusive relationship before she married my father," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Her first husband isolated her from her family, convinced her she was worthless, made her believe she deserved whatever he did to her. It took years for her to trust my father enough to tell him the truth about what she'd endured." The parallel was obvious, and Catalina felt her cheeks burn with shame. "Is it that obvious?" she asked. "How broken I am." "You're not broken," Dante said firmly. "You're surviving. There's a difference." His phone buzzed against the marble countertop, and when he glanced at it, his expression darkened. The number on the screen was Derek's, she realized, recognizing the digits that had haunted her for months. Before she could say anything, Dante had answered. "Derek," he said, his voice taking on that same cold authority she'd heard at the restaurant. "I thought we had an understanding last night." Catalina couldn't hear Derek's response, but she could imagine his voice, that particular tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable while making threats. She watched Dante's face become progressively more dangerous as he listened, his free hand clenching into a fist on the counter. "No, Derek," Dante said finally. "You're going to listen to me very carefully. Catalina is under my protection now. That means if you call her, if you text her, if you so much as drive past a place where you think she might be, you'll be dealing with me. And I promise you, that's not a conversation you want to have." He ended the call and looked at Catalina, who was staring at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror. She'd never had anyone stand up to Derek like that, had never had someone willing to put themselves between her and his anger. "He's not going to stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what he's like. He doesn't give up. He'll keep coming, keep finding ways to get to me. He'll hurt people I care about. He'll make my life hell until I give in and go back to him. Then we'll make sure he can't," Dante replied simply. The certainty in his voice should have been comforting, but instead it made her realize how completely her life had spiraled out of control. 3 months ago, she'd thought she was free. She'd built a little life for herself, found a job, made friends with her coworkers, started sleeping through the night without jolting awake at every sound. Now she was sitting in a stranger's kitchen, depending on a man she barely knew to protect her from another man who claimed to love her. The tears came suddenly, a flood of emotion she'd been holding back since Derek had walked into the restaurant. All the progress she'd made, all the small victories in rebuilding her confidence and independence, felt like they'd been swept away in a single moment. She was back to being that frightened girl who'd run from Derek's apartment with nothing but the clothes on her back. Except now she was dragging an innocent person into her mess. Dante moved around the counter without hesitation, not touching her, but positioning himself close enough that she could feel his warmth, his solid presence. He didn't try to tell her everything would be okay or offer empty reassurances. He just sat with her while she cried, occasionally handing her tissues from a box that appeared as if by magic. "I lost myself in that relationship," she said when the tears finally subsided. "I used to be confident, independent. I had dreams, plans for my future. He took all of that away, piece by piece, until I didn't even remember who I was supposed to be." "You're still that person," Dante said quietly. "She's just been hiding for a while, waiting for it to be safe to come back out." Looking at him, seeing the understanding in his dark eyes, Catalina felt something shift inside her. For the first time since Derek had walked back into her life, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face this alone. 3 days into staying at Dante's penthouse, Catalina had begun to understand the rhythm of his life. He left early each morning for what he called business meetings, always dressed in those perfectly tailored suits that probably cost more than she used to make in 6 months. He returned in the evenings with takeout from restaurants she recognized but had never been able to afford, expensive wine that he opened with the kind of casual ease that spoke of a lifetime of luxury. They'd fallen into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Coffee together in the morning, where he'd ask about her plans for the day with genuine interest. Dinner in the evening, where they'd discuss everything from her childhood in Pilsen to his opinions on the books she'd been reading from his extensive library. It was the kind of domestic intimacy she'd never experienced with Derek, who had seen her interests as inconveniences and her thoughts as irrelevant unless they centered on him. On Thursday evening, she finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building in her mind since that first morning. "We've been dancing around this for 3 days," she said as they shared a bottle of wine on his expansive terrace overlooking the lake. "What exactly is it that your family does? And please don't give me another euphemism about problem resolution." Dante was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass as he seemed to consider how much truth she could handle. The city lights twinkled below them, Chicago spreading out like a glittering carpet, and she could see boats moving slowly across the dark water of Lake Michigan. "My family controls territory on the south side," he said finally. "We manage certain businesses that operate outside traditional legal frameworks. We settle disputes that can't be resolved through official channels. We provide protection for people who need it and justice for those who can't get it anywhere else." "So you're in the Mafia," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "That's a word that carries a lot of assumptions," Dante replied. "But in the most basic sense, yes. My great-grandfather came here from Sicily with nothing and built an empire. My grandfather expanded it. My father legitimized parts of it. Now it's my responsibility to protect what they built while evolving it for a modern world." The admission should have terrified her, should have sent her running back to her tiny studio apartment and her minimum-wage job, back to a world where the worst danger she faced was an abusive ex-boyfriend rather than organized crime. Instead, she found herself leaning forward, wanting to understand this man who had shown her more genuine care in 3 days than Derek had managed in 18 months. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked. "Because protecting people is what you do?" "Partly," Dante admitted. "But mostly because watching that bastard hurt you made me want to do things that would have required explanations I wasn't prepared to give in a public restaurant." The violence implicit in his words should have been frightening, but instead she felt a warm flutter in her chest. Derek had always threatened to hurt people who interfered with his plans, but his threats had been about control and possession. When Dante spoke about violence, It was in service of protection, directed outward toward real threats rather than inward toward the person he claimed to care about. "Tell me about your family," Dante said, shifting the conversation away from his own darkness. "I know you have a sister." "Sophia," Catalina said, smiling despite everything. "She's 18, just started college at UIC. She's studying to be a nurse, wants to help people the way our grandmother did before she passed. She's nothing like me, brave and confident and sure of herself." "She sounds exactly like you," Dante observed. "At least, like who you are when you're not being terrorized by someone who should have been protecting you instead of hurting you." Catalina felt her cheeks warm at the quiet conviction in his voice. Derek had always told her that her family didn't really care about her, that she was the disappointment daughter who couldn't do anything right. He'd systematically cut her off from Sophia and her parents, convincing her that she was a burden they were better off without. "They tried to warn me about Derek," she said quietly. "My parents, Sophia, even some of my friends. But he was so charming when other people were around, so good at making me feel like I was the problem. He convinced me that their concerns were just jealousy, that they didn't want to see me happy." "Abusers are experts at isolation," Dante said, his voice heavy with old pain. "They make you believe that the people who love you are the real problem, that the only safety is in complete dependence on them." "Is that what happened to your mother?" "My father told me the story when I was old enough to understand it. Her first husband convinced her that her family had rejected her, that she was lucky he was willing to put up with her. It took years of my father's patience and consistency before she believed that love didn't have to come with conditions and threats." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Catalina found herself studying his profile in the city lights, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair caught the glow from the penthouse windows behind them. When had she stopped being afraid of him and started feeling drawn to him instead? As if sensing her attention, Dante turned to look at her, and she felt that flutter in her chest intensify. His eyes were dark and serious, and when his gaze dropped to her mouth for just a moment before returning to meet hers, she felt her breath catch. "Catalina," he said softly, and she could hear the warning in his voice, the same careful control he used when dealing with business matters. "This isn't a good idea." But he was reaching for her even as he spoke, his hand coming up to touch her cheek with devastating gentleness. His thumb traced across her skin, and she leaned into the contact despite every rational thought telling her this was dangerous in a completely different way than Derek had been. "Why?" she whispered, surprised by her own boldness. "Because you're vulnerable, and I'm not a good man, and you deserve better than someone who solves problems with violence and intimidation." But even as he said it, his hand was moving to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. She could see the conflict in his expression, could practically feel the battle between his protective instincts and his obvious desire. "What if I don't want better?" she asked, moving closer to him on the terrace's outdoor sofa. "What if I want someone who keeps me safe instead of making me feel like I need to be afraid?" His phone rang then, the sharp sound cutting through the tension between them like a knife. Dante cursed softly in what sounded like Italian and pulled back from her, his expression shifting to business mode as he checked the caller ID. "I have to take this," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Marco," he answered, walking to the far end of the terrace. Catalina couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the way Dante's shoulders tensed, the way his free hand clenched into a fist. When he returned to her, his face was dark with anger. "Derek paid a visit to your sister's dorm tonight," he said without preamble. "Campus security called it in when she reported a man asking her roommate about you." The wine glass slipped from Catalina's numb fingers, shattering on the terrace's stone floor. Sophia. He'd gone after Sophia, the one person Catalina would do anything to protect. The one person who had nothing to do with any of this except for the accident of being related to her. "Is she hurt?" Catalina managed to ask through the panic clawing at her throat. "She's fine. Scared, but unharmed. I've already sent people to make sure she's protected, and Derek has been informed that any further contact with your family will have serious consequences." The calm authority in Dante's voice cut through her panic, anchoring her to something solid when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. This was what real protection looked like, she realized. Not Derek's possessive control disguised as care, but decisive action taken to eliminate actual threats. How is it that I feel safer with a man who admits to being dangerous than I ever did with someone who claimed to love me? She asked, more to herself than to him. Because the difference between us and men like Derek, Dante said softly, is that our violence is directed outward, toward people who deserve it. We don't hurt the people we're meant to protect. Looking at him, seeing the absolute certainty in his dark eyes, Catalina realized that somewhere in the past 3 days, she had started falling for this complicated, dangerous man who had stepped into her life like an avenging angel. And for the first time since Derek had walked back into her world, she wasn't afraid of what that might mean. A week into living under Dante's protection, Catalina had begun to understand that the tension between them was becoming impossible to ignore. It crackled in the air during their morning coffee, simmered beneath their evening conversations, and made every accidental touch feel electric. She could see it in the way his eyes followed her movements around the penthouse, in the careful distance he maintained even when every instinct seemed to be drawing him closer. She'd started sleeping poorly again, but not because of nightmares about Derek. Instead, she found herself lying awake thinking about the man in the bedroom down the hall, wondering what it would feel like to touch him without fear, to be touched without the constant calculation of whether she was about to be hurt. It was a kind of want she'd forgotten existed, desire untainted by the expectation of pain that had colored every physical interaction she'd had for the past 2 years. Thursday evening, she was curled up in the living room with one of his books when the building's security alarm began to wail. Dante appeared from his office immediately, his expression shifting from concern to cold fury as he spoke rapidly into his phone. She caught fragments of the conversation, something about the parking garage and unauthorized access, and her blood ran cold as understanding hit her. "Derek," she said, and it wasn't a question. Dante nodded grimly, already moving toward the wall of windows that offered a view of the street below. Security stopped him before he got to the elevator, but he managed to damage 2 cars in the parking garage before they could subdue him. He's been taken into custody, but he'll be out on bail by tomorrow morning. Catalina felt that familiar paralysis creeping up her spine, the same helpless terror that had frozen her at the restaurant. A week of feeling safe, of beginning to believe she might be free, and Derek had shattered it all by simply showing up. He could find her anywhere, could get past any barrier she tried to put between them. The penthouse's security, Dante's protection, none of it would be enough to stop Derek's obsession. "Hey," Dante said softly, appearing in front of her without her realizing he'd moved. "Look at me, Catalina." She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing concern and something fiercer burning in their depths. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs stroking gently across her cheekbones, anchoring her to the present moment instead of the spiral of panic threatening to pull her under. "He didn't get to you," Dante said firmly. "He will never get to you. Do you understand me?" The absolute certainty in his voice cut through her fear, but it also highlighted something that had been building in her chest for days. She was tired of being afraid, tired of letting Derek's shadow dictate her choices, tired of living as a victim instead of a woman who deserved to feel desire and joy and the simple human connection of being touched with tenderness. "I'm sick of this," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'm sick of him having this power over me. Sick of feeling like I'm just surviving instead of living. I want to feel something other than fear." Dante's hands stilled against her face, and she could see him reading the shift in her expression, recognizing the change in her voice. "Catalina," he said carefully, and she could hear the warning beneath her name, the same restraint he'd been exercising for days. Instead of backing down, she stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to catch the subtle scent of his cologne. She could see the exact moment his control began to crack, could feel the tension in his hands where they still cupped her face. "I want to feel alive again," she said simply. "I want to remember what it's like to be touched by someone who actually cares about my pleasure instead of just taking what they want." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with invitation and possibility. Dante's eyes darkened, his grip on her face tightening almost imperceptibly, and she could see the war being fought behind his carefully controlled expression. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You're dealing with trauma, with fear. You might regret this tomorrow." "What if I don't?" she asked, moving even closer until she could feel his breath against her lips. What if this is the first choice I've made in 2 years that's actually mine instead of something forced on me by fear? That seemed to break the last of his resistance. His mouth came down on hers with a hunger that took her breath away, but even in his desperation, she could feel his restraint, the way he held back enough to let her set the pace. She kissed him back with all the need and want she'd been suppressing, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she could see something vulnerable in his expression that made her heart stutter. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Because once we cross this line, I won't be able to pretend that protecting you is just business anymore." Instead of answering with words, she took his hand and led him toward the bedroom, her heart pounding with anticipation rather than fear for the first time in longer than she could remember. Everything about the way Dante touched her was different from what she'd grown to expect from Derek. His hands were gentle but confident, reverent in a way that made her feel precious rather than possessed. He took his time with her, checking in with quiet questions and careful attention to her responses, as if her pleasure was more important than his own. When she tensed at certain touches, echoes of old trauma trying to surface, he would pause and wait, stroking her hair and whispering reassurances until she relaxed again. It was healing in a way she hadn't expected, reclaiming her own body through the experience of being truly cared for. Afterward, they lay tangled together in his enormous bed, her head on his chest and his arms wrapped securely around her. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her cheek, strong and steady, and for the first time in years, she felt completely safe in someone else's arms. "Tell me something about your life before all this," Dante said quietly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Something good, something that made you happy." Catalina smiled against his chest, thinking back to a time when her biggest worry had been whether she could afford to buy new textbooks for her college classes. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said. "Elementary school kids, maybe 3rd or 4th grade. I used to volunteer at an after-school program in Pilsen, helping kids with their homework. There was this one little girl, Maria, who struggled with reading but loved stories. We'd spend hours together, and watching her face light up when she finally understood something. It was the best feeling in the world." "You'd be amazing at that," Dante said, and she could hear the conviction in his voice. "You have the patience for it, the gentleness. Those kids would be lucky to have you." The certainty in his words made her chest tight with emotion. Derek had always dismissed her dreams as naive or unrealistic, had convinced her that she wasn't smart enough or capable enough to achieve anything meaningful. But Dante spoke as if her aspirations were not only valid but inevitable. "What about you?" she asked. "If you could do anything, be anyone, what would you choose?" Dante was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "Something legitimate," he said finally. "Something where I could use my skills to protect people without having to operate in the shadows. Maybe private security or crisis management. Something where I could help people like you without having to worry about whether my methods would hold up in court." The vulnerability in his admission made her lift her head to look at him. In the dim light filtering through the bedroom windows, his face was softer than she'd ever seen it, the harsh edges of command and control smoothed away by intimacy. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and Dante's expression immediately hardened as he reached for it. The display showed a number she didn't recognize, but when he answered, Derek's voice came through clear enough for her to hear. "I hope you enjoyed your little celebration," Derek said, his voice thick with rage. "Because I've just made some calls to your coworkers at Romano's. If you don't come home where you belong, they're going to start paying for your selfishness. Starting with that sweet little Maria who's been covering your shifts." The line went dead, and Catalina felt the bottom drop out of her world. Derek wasn't just threatening her anymore. He was going after innocent people, people who had only tried to help her, and he would keep escalating until she gave him what he wanted. But when she looked at Dante, she didn't see the resigned acceptance she expected. Instead, his face was set in lines of absolute determination, the same expression she'd seen when he'd sent Derek running from the restaurant. "No more," Dante said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. "This ends now. Permanently." Looking at him, feeling the solid strength of his body beside her, and seeing the protective fury in his dark eyes, Catalina realized that for the first time since Derek had walked back into her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next, because she wasn't facing it alone anymore. The call came at 3 in the morning, Derek's voice dripping with satisfaction when Dante answered Catalina's phone. "She's really quite pretty, your little sister," Derek said, and Catalina felt her blood turn to ice. Sophia was supposed to be safe in her dorm, protected by the security team Dante had assigned. "Reminds me of you. Actually, back when you still knew how to be grateful for what you had." "Where is she?" Dante asked, his voice deadly calm even as Catalina watched his free hand clench into a fist. "Somewhere you'll never find her unless Catalina comes home like a good girl," Derek replied. "She has exactly 2 hours to present herself at the warehouse district on South Racine, alone and unarmed, or sweet little Sophia is going to discover what happens to people who get in my way." The line went dead, and Catalina was already moving toward the bedroom to get dressed. Every instinct screamed at her to run straight to wherever Derek was waiting, to throw herself at his mercy if it meant keeping Sophia safe. But Dante's hand on her arm stopped her, his grip gentle but unbreakable. "We do this together," he said firmly. "No negotiations, no heroic sacrifices. We get your sister back, and we end this permanently." "He's going to kill her," Catalina said, the words coming out as a broken whisper. "He's going to hurt her because of me, because I finally found the courage to leave him. I should never have involved you in this, should never have let you protect me." "Stop," Dante said, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Look at me. This is not your fault. Derek made his choices, and now he's going to face the consequences." Within 30 minutes, Dante had mobilized a team of 6 men, all of them moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke of military or law enforcement training. They traced Derek's location through cell tower data and traffic cameras, narrowing down his position to an abandoned warehouse in an area of the city where screams wouldn't draw attention and bodies could disappear without questions being asked. Catalina insisted on coming despite Dante's protests, and eventually he relented when she pointed out that Derek might hurt Sophia if he realized Catalina wasn't actually alone. She rode in the back seat of Dante's armored sedan, watching the city pass by in a blur of streetlights and empty buildings, her hands shaking with a mixture of terror and determination. The warehouse was exactly the kind of place Derek would choose, isolated and dark with multiple exits in case he needed to run. Dante's team moved into position around the building while he and Catalina approached the main entrance, their footsteps echoing in the vast space between shipping containers and abandoned machinery. They found Derek in the center of the warehouse, standing behind Sophia, who was tied to a chair with duct tape over her mouth. Catalina's sister looked terrified but unharmed, her eyes wide with relief when she saw Catalina approaching. Derek had positioned himself so that any direct approach would require going through Sophia first, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder in a gesture that made Catalina's stomach turn. "There's my girl," Derek said, his voice warm and welcoming as if this were a reunion between lovers instead of a hostage situation. "I knew you'd come to your senses eventually. You always were smart enough to know when you were beaten." "Let her go," Catalina said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "This is between us, Derek. Sophia has nothing to do with any of this." "She has everything to do with this," Derek replied, his grip tightening on Sophia's shoulder until she whimpered behind the tape. "She's leverage, sweetheart. Insurance that you'll remember your place and stop playing house with this criminal you've been slumming with." Dante stepped forward slightly, his movement so smooth and controlled that it looked casual to anyone who didn't know him. But Catalina could see the predator beneath the surface, could feel the danger radiating from him like heat from a fire. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, Derek," Dante said conversationally. "The smart play here is to release the girl and walk away. I'll even give you a 5-minute head start before my people come looking for you." Derek laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria to the sound that suggested his confidence was starting to crack. "You think I'm afraid of you? You think your mob connections impress me? I was controlling this little bitch when you were still playing dress-up in your expensive suits. That was a mistake." Catalina saw the moment Derek's words triggered something dangerous in Dante, saw the careful control slip just enough to reveal the violence underneath. But Derek was too focused on his own rage to notice the shift, too caught up in his need to reassert dominance to recognize that he had just signed his own death warrant. The confrontation happened fast. Derek, realizing that his psychological manipulation wasn't working, pulled out a knife and pressed it to Sophia's throat. But he'd underestimated both Dante's speed and Catalina's desperate courage. While Derek was focused on Dante's approach from the front, Catalina circled behind him, using the shadows between machinery to get close enough to grab the wooden handle of an old tool from an abandoned workbench. The blow caught Derek across the back of his skull, hard enough to stagger him, but not enough to take him down completely. The knife clattered away from Sophia's throat as Derek spun toward Catalina, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. But his moment of distraction was all Dante needed. The confrontation was over in seconds, decisive and final in the way that Dante had promised. In the aftermath, while Sophia cried against Catalina's shoulder and Dante's team handled the cleanup with professional efficiency, Catalina felt something fundamental shift inside her. For 18 months, Derek had made her believe she was helpless, that she was nothing without him. But tonight, when it mattered most, she had acted. She had protected someone she loved instead of cowering in fear. The police report would list Derek's death as the result of a drug deal gone wrong in a part of the city where such things happen regularly. There would be no investigation, no questions asked about the warehouse or the coincidental timing of his demise. In Dante's world, some problems simply disappeared without leaving traces behind. 2 weeks later, when the trauma had faded enough for normal conversation and Sophia was back to her classes with a security detail she pretended to find annoying, Dante took Catalina to dinner at Romano's. It felt like coming full circle, sitting in the restaurant where their story had begun, but this time she wasn't afraid to be seen there. She wasn't looking over her shoulder or calculating escape routes. She was simply a woman enjoying dinner with a man who had proven he would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. After dessert, when Giuseppe had cleared their table and given them privacy, Dante reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box that made Catalina's breath catch. The ring inside was vintage, clearly an heirloom, with a center stone that caught the restaurant's warm lighting and threw it back in brilliant sparks. "This was my grandmother's ring," Dante said quietly. "She wore it for 63 years, through world wars and family feuds, and everything else that tried to tear her and my grandfather apart. She always said it was blessed with the kind of love that survives anything." Catalina stared at the ring, then up at his face, seeing vulnerability there that she'd learned to treasure. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she managed to say. "I'm asking you to marry me," Dante said simply. "I'm asking you to build a life with me, to let me protect and cherish you for the rest of our lives. I'm asking you to trust me with forever." The yes came without hesitation, bubbling up from somewhere deep in her chest where hope and love had been growing stronger every day. "Yes," she said, laughing through tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Yes, absolutely yes." 6 months later, Catalina stood in the bridal suite at St. Alphonsus Church in Little Italy, watching Sophia fuss with the vintage lace of her wedding dress. Her sister had thrown herself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of someone who had been denied the chance to organize anything during the dark months of Derek's terror, and the result was everything Catalina had dreamed of but never expected to have. The dress itself was a masterpiece of understated elegance, chosen specifically because it made Catalina feel beautiful rather than displayed. The cathedral veil had belonged to Dante's mother, a gesture of acceptance into the Romano family that still made Catalina emotional when she thought about it too much. "You look radiant," Sophia said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Seriously, I don't think I've ever seen you glow like this." Catalina smiled, one hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach where a tiny life was just beginning to make itself known. The pregnancy was barely confirmed, too early to show but already filling her with a joy she hadn't expected. She and Dante had been trying since the engagement, both of them eager to start the family they'd dreamed about during those long conversations on his terrace. "There's something I need to tell you," Catalina said, unable to keep the secret any longer. "Something wonderful." Sophia's eyes went wide as understanding dawned, and she let out a squeal of excitement that probably carried all the way to the church sanctuary. "A baby? Really? Does Dante know?" "I'm telling him tonight," Catalina admitted, "as a wedding present." The ceremony itself passed in a blur of incense and candlelight, of promises spoken in both English and Italian, of tears and laughter from family and friends who had worried they'd never see this day. When Dante lifted her veil and kissed her with all the tender passion that had marked their relationship from the beginning, Catalina felt the last shadows of her past finally fade away completely. At the reception, as they swayed together during their first dance to music that Sofia had chosen specifically for its romantic lyrics, Dante whispered in her ear about honeymoon plans and the house they were buying in Lincoln Park where they could raise children and grow old together. "I have something to tell you," Catalina whispered back, smiling up at him with all the love and joy that filled her heart to overflowing. When she shared the news about their baby, she watched his face transform with wonder and fierce protectiveness, the same expression he'd worn that first night when he'd stepped between her and Derek's threats. But this time, the protection was for their future rather than rescue from her past. Later, as the reception wound down and guests began to drift home filled with good food and expensive wine, Catalina found herself on the venue's balcony overlooking the lake, still in her wedding dress, but with her shoes kicked off and her veil flowing behind her in the evening breeze. "Any regrets?" Dante asked, joining her at the railing and pulling her close against his side. "About marrying a man who runs organized crime operations for a living?" She teased, then grew serious. "Never. Not for a single second. You saved me, Dante. You gave me back my life." "You saved yourself," he corrected gently. "I just made sure you had the space to remember who you really are." Looking out over the city lights, feeling the solid warmth of her husband beside her and the promise of new life growing inside her, Catalina realized that Derek had been wrong about so many things. She wasn't broken or worthless or lucky that anyone wanted her. She was strong and valuable and deserving of the kind of love that built rather than destroyed, that protected rather than possessed. If you're watching this tonight and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, she thought, remembering the fear and desperation that had once defined her days, please know that there's a way out. There are people who will help, who will stand between you and the person hurting you. True love doesn't come with threats or conditions or demands for complete surrender of yourself. True love makes you braver, stronger, more yourself than you ever imagined possible. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, true love comes with enough power to make sure the people who hurt you can never do it again.